Good afternoon. I am very excited to be here with you this afternoon. Thank you very much, Eric, Michael, and Brian, for inviting me. And for this year being risky and shining a much-needed light on the critical topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I started at HIP in January of this year, and it's something that I think about every single day as the new head of the organization, Hispanics in Philanthropy. I know we have a cocktail reception, but before then, there's two key things I'd like to bring to your attention. Number one is to emphasize, as was said in the previous panel and the ones before that, philanthropy in 2018 is not what it used to be. We're in a new era of philanthropy. Business as usual won't cut it. We need a brand new playbook. And the second thing I want to leave you with is to share how my organization in this moment is helping to reframe philanthropy so that it can be diverse, equitable, and inclusion. And this is especially for the Latino community because we are so often overlooked. And this, as we've heard earlier today, is going to take real courage. It's going to take inspired leadership. And it's just not any kind of leadership, but it's going to be moral leadership. The kind that stands against injustice and does not budge. The kind that is led by Black, brown, indigenous, undocumented, queer, disabled, and white communities. Everyone, together. But as we also heard this afternoon, before I go any further, I'm going to tell you a few stories. Because stories is what you'll remember. So my first story, I want to take you to Miami, a place peppered with memories from my high school days. It's a lively place with salsa dancing, abuelitas drinking cafecitos at Versailles on Southwest 8th Street, the click-clack of old men playing dominoes, smoking cigars, and talking politics, very loud and very fast. Like so many of you here today, from wherever we come from, my worldview was shaped by events that unfolded in my own backyard. And very much like Los Angeles in the 1990s after the beating of Rodney King, and more recently, Baltimore and Ferguson, where frustration spilled over into the streets. It happened in Miami too, and that's the 1980s, the Liberty City riots. The riots began in much the same way that we saw in Baltimore and Ferguson. 4 police officers killed a Marine veteran, a Black man, a decent man named Arthur Duffy, and they beat him to death. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, and they acquitted the officers. An exasperated community took to the streets, first in protest, but later in violence, and the governor called in the National Guard, and violence escalated, and it spread all across the city. Miami was literally and emotionally on fire. At the time, I was 16 years old, and I was working as a cashier. I worked at the pharmacy at the Omni Hotel downtown. All of us who worked at the hotel were trapped, and we were forced to shelter in place for 3 days. I remember going to the hotel's rooftop, and I was watching the skyline of the city all around me, the city that I called home, and it was burning all around me. That day, I witnessed the raw edges of our city, and the racial tensions split open. And in Miami, we finally saw each other for who we really are. And it hit me really hard as a 16-year-old. Not just the realization of what was happening, but why it was happening. That was more important. And then the days that followed, we also saw that so many people lost their homes. They lost their jobs and their livelihoods too. They had been so frustrated with a system that reeked of embedded racism, and it reeked of institutional bias. There was a lack of opportunity and hope. The government obviously did not care about them. So many of their neighbors in Miami did not care about them. And we learned riots just don't happen when people feel that they belong. But we all know that Miami did not just crumble in that aftermath. The riots, as horrible and terrible as they were, did start a dialogue in our community, a slow path to help, heal, rebuild, and to address those inequities, that injustice, and that lack of power. Today, there are so many challenges that persist in Miami, and there's so much work to do. There is no silver bullet. We've learned that today. There's only baby steps. And as you might predict, for me personally, witnessing that city's destruction and the frustration, nearly 40 years, it put fire somewhere else. It put fire in my belly. And it inspired me to dedicate my life to address the injustices I saw in those Miami fires. No other city should ever burn again. I found my voice and my calling. And you might think that what keeps me going is this injustice, this response to the injustice, but that's not what keeps me going. It's the power of hope, the fundamental belief in humanity, in dignity, and in justice all around us. And every day, especially for the past year and a half, I've seen that hope, I've seen the collective power, I've seen the resilience, the strength, not only of our Latino community, but of all of our communities, amidst all of the scapegoating, the racism, the xenophobia, and the growing uncertainty. And it's so important to hold on to that hope. We can do that. It's in our mind, right? We have to do it now because fear and scapegoating and racism are such powerful levers, and those are the levers that are underlying the policies that are still tearing the families apart today. And you've seen these images of families and babies being ripped from their parents' arms, children being kept in cages. The press calls it the crisis at the US-Mexico border, and I want to flag, I have a big concern about this, because it takes the story of a real life, human family, a loving family with so much dignity, and it dehumanizes them. We're immediately moved from thinking of them as real people to thinking of them as political actors and sometimes even as criminals. And so think about that. How many of you have your own babies? We've talked about babies. But you might have also nieces or nephews or kids that you talk to on the block. Imagine those beautiful kids, those children that you know, and then imagine him or her in a cage. And then imagine that at 3, a child cannot understand the politics of this and only see the darkness and only see themselves as alone. This is a stain on our nation's soul, and this treatment is unspeakable. Especially because we can bet good money that most of, not all, of these parents, the parents in these children's lives, traveled such long distances in order to protect them. They're escaping civil unrest, certain death, sometimes domestic violence, and that makes them refugees and asylum seekers. Legal status, the color of your skin, your nationality, none of these should ever be a reason for forcibly tearing a child from his or her parent. And this is a moral crisis. It's a test of our national character. And so far, we are failing this test. So far, the social sector is failing. And philanthropy, even with all of its resources, is also failing. On June 30th, I had the privilege to speak at the Keep Families Together March in Washington, D.C. And it was such an incredible demonstration. The first time ever I've witnessed in my life such a diverse crowd, people of all backgrounds, marching all for immigrants. I was inspired and I knew that at HIP we needed to take action, and within days we organized a delegation of our country's most important philanthropic organizations, national foundations and local funders alike, all to travel to San Diego. I'll confess that my hope was to bring 20 funders to the border. But even with just 2 weeks' notice, in the middle of summer vacations, 50 funders, including our Dr. Ross, interrupted their plans to attend. And I want to share an aha from that trip. Big aha. Trapped on the US-Mexico border, there are people from all over the world from Mexico, Guatemala, Cuba, Haiti, but also as far away as India, Congo, and Nepal. People of all colors and classes, all living in limbo, trapped in detention centers, shelters, and tent cities, not knowing what their future holds. And what it showed us is that it's far more complicated than an undocumented people story. Because even people who are following the rules, people who are following immigration procedures are getting caught up in this crisis. Even though the zero tolerance policy is being phased out, real threats to the Flores Amendment exist. That's the amendment that keeps us from keeping children in detention more than 20 days. And the criminalization of asylum seekers under Operation Streamline escalates. Operation Streamline, what's that? It's code language. It means the rapid criminalization and the overnight prosecution of those crossing the border, including those that are asylum seekers. So what happens? Groups of 50 individuals at the same time go before a judge for mass court proceedings, often in shackles, but remember, they're all at the same time, usually without access to an attorney. In many cases, they are advised it's just best to plead guilty. They're told this not in their language either. And what that means is not only that they will be eventually deported, but that they will also possibly serve up to 15 months in federal detention. And for those who choose to fight their case, the wait time in detention can be even longer, several years, and that's without your kids. So think about that, especially those of you that are parents. Is that a tenable choice? Our goal for the delegation was to keep the focus on the very human toll these policies have had on the most vulnerable among us. We used the experience to bring in new funders, those that don't normally fund immigration, human rights, and refugee issues. But now they saw it as a moral crisis. And thanks to this delegation, we raised over $1 million in less than a month to fund the work of the organizations that are doing the front lines, providing counsel services. And we need much more, but the challenge to all of us and to philanthropy is to stay the course. And we're working at HIP. We won't stop until families and children are all safe. And then if you give me the opportunity, thank you. I'll tell you one more story, the last one. I'd like to take you to the beautiful island where I was born, Puerto Rico. Let me take you a few months back. It's June. It is dusk in Mariana, a barrio on the eastern coast of Puerto Rico. Mariana sits at the epicenter of Hurricane Maria's landfall. Tonight, the streets are dark, but they are not silent. Because even though Mariana still has no power or running water, there are voices and there's a lot of laughter on the streets as people cook dinner together over makeshift outdoor stoves. Mariana's residents, like many other Puerto Ricans, are making the best of a desperate situation. Almost 1 year later to the day. The resourcefulness of the Puerto Rican people in the face of Hurricane Maria is admirable, but being admirable goes only so far. Just imagine in your community taking care of your children, going about your daily business with no power and no running water. And then, you know what I'm going to say. Imagine that your elected leaders said that everything was just fine. FEMA admitted that it failed to properly prepare and mobilize that response, the response that Puerto Rico needed. And they could have done it. They could have mobilized USDA, HUD, other resources, but they quite simply failed Puerto Rico. Maria's 150-mile-per-hour winds unleashed a full-blown humanitarian crisis on American soil. It claimed somewhere between 3,000, 4,000 souls. There's lots of studies to show that. The numbers aren't cooked. Those are more lives than were lost in 9/11 and it was the longest blackout in our country's history. Even today, services are not fully operational. There's plenty of places that still lack water. The elderly are a particular risk. Remember your abuelitas. They simply cannot cope with that. It was a man-made disaster overlaid with a natural disaster. And it caused a massive failure to respond to the needs of 3.5 million US citizens. So what's our responsibility to these fellow Americans on the island? I don't think any of us have easy answers, but at HIP, we know one thing is clear. We're just not doing enough because it's going to take long-term investment to build the resilience and rebuild the economy. It will take a shift, and you're seeing why. According to data from the Foundation Center, we learned that foundation support in 2017, so that's last year, the year that Maria hit, stood at only 62 million. That came mostly after September. And you can compare that with the 341 million in the same time that was provided to Texas, which was devastated by Hurricane Harvey, and the 128 million that was provided to Florida in Hurricane Maria, philanthropic dollars. Thanks to those investments and the federal government, Texas and Florida were able to get back on their feet. Not perfect, but they're getting there. If you go to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, however, you'll see that they continue to struggle to meet basic needs. So what accounts for this disparity? Sadly, my sense, my hypothesis is that some foundations somehow don't think that Puerto Rico is American enough to deserve this domestic funding. But it's also a quandary because if you go to international charities, it's not foreign enough to qualify for funding there either. So it's been easier for Puerto Rico to fall through the limbo, to fall through the cracks, and it's been ignored for decades. You could also, quite simply and bluntly, call it racism. Because prior to the hurricane, Puerto Rico wasn't much better off. They were suffering from crushing bankruptcy that had paralyzed the island's economy. You'll see that in 2015, the island received 5 million, in philanthropic funds, and other economically distressed cities like Detroit and Memphis received over 200 million, Buffalo 67 million, and right here in California, Fresno, 20 million. So we can see the story, we can see the disparity. And that's why HIP has organized trips to Puerto Rico too, to see firsthand the devastation in places like Mariana, and to figure out how philanthropy might strategically invest for the future. And here's the bottom line: Puerto Ricans are demonstrating their tenacity, their creativity, ingenuity, and capacity. It's now time for philanthropy to prove that they have the will and the capacity to act before it's too late. And we pray and we hope that another hurricane doesn't strike this season. And as we sit here today, we pray and hope that our brothers and sisters living in the Carolinas are safe and that they brace for their own storm today. And so that takes me to a point, no more stories, to share with you. Government or philanthropy, neither, even if they were perfect, are no longer enough. They're not enough here in the United States, and they're no longer enough anywhere in the US. We need to harness new tools and resources, and we need to find new allies and partners. A quick example from HIP. In the wake of Maria, we have a bilingual crowdfunding platform called HIP Give. And in just a matter of a few days, we were able to raise over $650,000 in donations from over 700 individuals. And that was before the community foundations on the ground were able to get any electricity, get themselves up and running. We wanted to make sure there was a place so that we could immediately get first responders responding, and so that we could get businesses, especially small businesses, up on the island, back up and running, so people could start rebuilding their lives. So with everything I'm doing at HIP, with everything I'm thinking about, it's all about how do we usher in a new era of philanthropy. So we're democratizing philanthropy. We're building the leadership ecosystem, which we've talked about today. We're getting resources to nonprofits working on the front lines, and very importantly, changing the narrative so that we could address these issues that we're talking about today, diversity, equity, inclusion. And we can think creatively and differently about why we invest and how we invest, who gets to invest, and where do we invest. So let me reiterate, that means it's critical in our work at HIP and all of our work all together needs to be thinking about how do we create investment vehicles that allow everyone and anyone to be a philanthropist. We talked about this in the earlier session, about those power dynamics. Now with respect to Latinos, people often ask me, you people, you don't really have a culture of philanthropy. This is new to you. And I always get a little bit upset. And I challenge that myth. And people go away thinking, maybe there's something there. Because Latinos do have a very vibrant tradition of giving. It just looks a little different. But in study after study, we've seen that households, in the last study I read showed 63% of households, they are giving to charities in the US. And the big surprise, they give at slightly higher percentages than their white counterparts. If you're looking at household spending, it's 1.2% versus 1%. So if you look at that, and you look at the buying power of the Latinx community, which is $1.4 trillion, and you think about it, it's an untapped market of 55 million people. So, one of the reasons I took this job, it's a huge opportunity for impact and for investment. What we need to do is develop these on-ramps into civic engagement and into philanthropy so that Latinos can see themselves as givers. That's really also recognizing that all of us have a role to play, and all of us as communities of color must invest in ourselves. We must harness our collective power, and then that way we can leverage, not rely on, leverage philanthropic dollars to build the fabric of our own institutions. Because if we don't invest in ourselves, after all, who will? So what I need for you to come away with is that we all need to pay attention and to ask, whatever sector you work, whatever sector you represent, to ask philanthropy, to remind philanthropy how much work we still have to do. Let us be the conscious. I took this role at Hispanics in Philanthropy because I didn't like the direction we were going in. It was hard to stay on the sidelines with the open attacks. But yeah, it feels overwhelming. But by leading all of us together, learning all of us together, we can inspire people to be their best selves, to bring hope to a world that needs it so badly. And hope is a great word. And for many years, many of us thought that that was where we were, because we were living in a post-racial world. After all, we did elect a black president. Imagine that. The one thing that we know in this current climate is that there is a lot of work to do. There is no more hiding, at least, and no more ignoring that there is racism, misogyny, bigotry, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ sentiment, and it's festering in our communities. But now, because we can all see it, and because we can no longer hide it, this is why we can finally end it. So the question is, do we have what it takes, and are we made of iron? Because if we're not made of iron, and we're just naively optimistic, and we're just thinking and praying, it's not going to work. We must be made of iron. And we must think differently. Our sector tends to ignore the moral issues and goes straight to tactics, strategies, business plans. And we can't do that anymore. We have to act from moral leadership. I said moral leadership. Moral courage is good, But what we need right now is moral leadership. It takes moral courage to speak out against injustice. That's indisputably needed. But it is our moral leadership that will make the difference. In other words, statements, words are nice, but are we aligning those words with our actions and our money? Are we strong enough leaders to all work together, to put aside those business plans and agendas, to move beyond our institutional brands, to move beyond our fundraising needs to a shared purpose? Do we risk bringing others with us? Do we stray from our work plans in the middle of the year if it's going to cause change? A few months ago, I had to ask myself these hard questions, and I made tough decisions. I saw that it was important and necessary to move from moral courage to moral leadership, from witnessing and speaking out to taking action. And I remembered the words of Audre Lorde. I hope you know her. She's amazing. And she taught us that divide and conquer must become define and empower. Thank you. Moral leadership will require us to both define and empower. That has been HIP's focus with the border delegation, taking foundations to Puerto Rico, working with future leaders, working to define the problems so that others can see and comprehend, with the ultimate goal to empower the social sector and philanthropy. It's our job to bring people together to learn and understand these challenges, to learn the names and the faces of the victims of injustice, and to find our common cause to act. Because a divide and conquer strategy has been used too often, and it's been used very effectively against our communities. We're divided into different political parties, racial groups, and economic classes. Northerners, Southerners, immigrants, citizens, white, black, brown. This has been imposed on us. But honestly, we also do it to ourselves. Liberals dismiss conservatives as ignorant and racist. Conservatives dismiss liberals as soft and overly PC. We heard a lot of those values this afternoon. And don't get me wrong, we all feel the need to belong to community. Group membership is important. We need to find each other, to stick together, especially for groups that have been oppressed. It's essential. But Audre Lorde, she reminded us, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. The tactics of divide and conquer are the master's tools. They are meant to break up strong movement-building leadership, take away open access to knowledge and information, corrupt details of historical events, and make us distrust what we hear and who we once believed. These are the obstacles that prevent us from uniting. So we got a couple $1 million questions. The questions that get at the heart of the structural inequality and the power in America. I don't have easy answers because they're not easy questions. But I do have a hunch. I have a hunch. And so many of you are here at Stanford, and you're here to learn from each other. And my hunch is that every time we connect, we communicate, and we collaborate, we help to build stronger networks that open access to greater knowledge. Essentially, every time we come together, we share what is working, we undermine this inequity. And Audre Lorde taught us, dismantling systems of divide and conquer, it's not an academic skill. So even though we're at Stanford, we can do it. She urged us to find common causes, to work with others outside of our circles, so we could define and we could seek a world where we can all flourish based on our differences, and they are also our strengths. In essence, that's the reason why we're here. That's what the work about DEI is all about, and that is what HIP's work has been about these 35 years, finding common causes, the engaging, connecting, communicating towards real change. So I leave you by asking you to step into your moral leadership. Let's render that divide and conquer strategy ineffective. Let's shift our focus from our current tasks long enough to work together, truly and intentional, engage each other, expand that table, partner with those that you've never partnered before. Let's ask those tough questions together. Let's support each other in moral leadership. Let's take action. It always seems impossible until it's done. So let's do it, and let's do it together. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I've been thinking about this for a whole month. I gave up my vacation to think about this. No, I'm serious. What did I want to share with you today? These are not normal times. So thank you for listening. And I'd love to have some questions if we have about 15 minutes. Great, thank you. Or we can go to the cocktail party.
I don't think anyone wants to leave until they get to ask you all the good questions. I'm over here.
There we go. Okay, sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I was wondering if you could, my name's Lauren Smith, I'm at FSG. I was wondering if you could speak to, you alluded to this, the idea that there's a disbelief in some of the facts that you presented about the mortality and the outcomes in Puerto Rico after the hurricane. And just today we have commentary about whether or not those were actual facts or made up. What do you think the role is of foundations, philanthropy in this issue of are there facts, are there not facts? Is there such a thing as truth? Is it not truth? And that whole piece around disbelieving what's out there.
I don't think I need that mic. Yeah, I think I can walk. I just came to Hispanics in Philanthropy in January. Before that, I had the pleasure and honor of working at the Ford Foundation, and I also worked at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So I've seen foundations at the national level, and now I also work with community foundations and local foundations and corporate foundations. So many of them are doing this good work, trying to uncover what the numbers are. And there's great works like the Center for Investigative Journalism. Without them, so many of the studies in Puerto Rico would not have come. So many of the stories would not have come. There's an organization called Change Philanthropy. And if you don't know them, you should. They have their conference every 2 years. Last year, actually, on the day that Maria hit, we were in New Orleans, and they'll be meeting next year in Seattle. Look at their work. Change Philanthropy is a space, and I'm proud to be on the executive steering committee, where philanthropy that cares about power building, structural inequities, and racism comes together to coordinate. And so what philanthropy has been doing really well is coordinating these spaces and funding these spaces so that we can know the truth, share information, and really respond. But there right now is a lot of work around narrative shift. I'm happy to work on that space as well. And with the work of narrative shift, sometimes it's stories and sometimes it's numbers. Foundation Center, GuideStar, all of those organizations are giving us the numbers. And I think the combination between the two of the stories and the narrative shift and the numbers is what's happening, and it helps us, I think, to be effective. Philanthropy has been helpful, and there are also tables of philanthropists that are interested in, and I can get that for you afterwards. There's an affinity group of philanthropists that are working on narrative change and on storytelling, and I'm putting that out.
So, other than showing up at the border for the kids in the cages, who is doing the most strategic thinking, and how can we all really mobilize on that?
Thank you. We took funders to San Diego and Tijuana for a reason. We could have taken them to the Texas border, and they would have seen what you see on the Associated Press and what you hear on NPR. We took them to San Diego because we wanted to shift the stereotype as to who's getting stuck in the limbo and what is happening, and to show that it's not people that are doing something wrong, especially to show that even the people that are coming and doing it the right way and they're asking for political asylum are getting stuck and are in limbos, and that is not right, that those are not our country's values. We've been working with grant makers concerned with immigrants and refugees, and that's an amazing organization that is helping us develop the policy angles of what needs to happen and to be able to be advocates. But we're also developing funds. The fund that we put together now is a $1 million fund, which now we're working with local communities, community foundations as well, to match it with expectation that we can have $2 million. We need more, but we have resources for legal fights, for that advocacy, for the bail bonds. There's a huge need for also the mental trauma, health, well-being aspect. That's very underfunded. All of those issues that are not just immediate, but will also have years and years and years of a impact. And so we're raising money for that, but we know where the children are for the most part, in terms of not individual children, but we know where the shelters are, and we know that the administration, as of last Thursday, put in the Federal Register, and they're trying to repeal the Flores Amendment. There's 60 days to have commentary. So what can you do? I'd be happy to send around the link so that everybody registers comments and says, no, the Flores Agreement is right. We shouldn't be keeping any child longer than 20 days. And we're also trying to get resources to the community organizations on the ground that are providing those services. And so if you know of community foundations that would want to match double their dollars, please send them to me. We're working with them right now.
But it does seem to me that we started this morning with Rashad and Color of Change and the sort of the strike on the corporate backbone. Mm-hmm. And here we have, in less than a year or 2 years, maybe it was hidden longer, an entire system to incarcerate families and children. And so how do we take that system down equally quickly?
Absolutely. And it's been going for a while. You might remember 2014. The press didn't cover it in 2014, but there was a huge crisis of unaccompanied minors. That's when all those beds got, and those facilities got built. It was during that crisis. And so the system very easily now was already primed and ready for what happened now. And I kid you not, and I have witnesses, when we were at the Southwest Key facility, the children's facility, tender age they call it, down in San Diego last month, I swear, the official that was in charge, overseeing from the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, because it's a different foster care system, the federal foster care system, than the state foster care system. She said, we just weren't ready for zero tolerance. It was a blip in the system, and we weren't prepared for 2,500 kids to flood us overnight. And she called them a blip in the system. She also insisted on calling them unaccompanied children. And we're like, no, they were accompanied, but then you took them away. She's like, no, technically, we don't call them that. We call them unaccompanied, and they just would not accept that they were accompanied. and we're taken away. And that's the way we were talking about frames earlier this afternoon around stories and communication, and the frames that we hang on to and what we deny and let through. That's very real. It spoke to me very clearly. Yes?
Kind of piggybacking on that, in the last couple of days, there's been a lot of reporting about the shifting of dollars, right, from FEMA and from the Coast Guard. 29 million, I think, from the Coast Guard as we brace for this next hurricane. And so going back to the storytelling, is it your intent, or have you, I mean, obviously this is just breaking, so to tell the new story about resources being diverted away from the overall public safety of the U.S. or whatnot, and coupling that with tearing families apart, right? So this administration clearly identifies young children and people seeking safety in the U.S. as the bigger threat than the hurricanes, and so much so that he's diverting so much money away so that they can invest that in ICE.
Yeah, I thought it was 10 million. I'm very...
29 million from the Coast Guard,
10 million.
so far.
Okay. The stories are important. We're in the position that we're in right now. It's because stories have perpetuated bias. They've perpetuated... I have a baseball cap, and it says San Juan, Puerto Rico, 1519. And I love to wear it because they perpetuated that we're all like recent immigrants just arrived yesterday and we don't belong. Just this week, if you are affiliated with UCLA, you would have seen the Smithsonian report. There is no museum, there is no wing of the Smithsonian that talks about Latinos, Latinx being part of the history. I think we have an exhibit with Cesar and Dolores, but it's very, very scarce. And so, yeah, there's all these stories that perpetuate that we don't belong here. By the way, the oldest capitals are San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Santa Fe, in New Mexico, in this country. So we've been here. But we alluded to it earlier. It's not just stories, it's also the power building. We would not be in this position that we are in today if there was influence, access, and dollars. And so we have to build that. And so that's why at HIP, when I came, I started thinking about how do we democratize philanthropy. And it was a short mention of it, but that's really important. And democratizing philanthropy means that we are actually all building and contributing towards the fabric of our institutions. Instead of expecting others, philanthropy, corporate, to build it, no. Turn it around. We go to them. Hey, we're investing in our organizations, and you can leverage. You can invest too, but starting with us as powerful. And that's what we need to do. And how do we do these on-ramps to philanthropy so that we can all be investors in our community? That's really important. We don't have it figured out, but we're trying to figure out how to do that. And if we can do that, then we can leverage influence and we can leverage power. But we're also working on civic engagement. Right now we have a mini grants program, civic engagement in the South. In the South, states like Texas and Florida, where you know that there's Latinos, states like North Carolina, where, yeah, we've heard it's a gateway city, but also states like Louisiana and Georgia. Do you know that Georgia is the 10th largest city for Latinos in terms of absolute numbers? No, if you go to Georgia, you don't realize that. But yeah, they're there. And they're in Arkansas and in Tennessee, everywhere. And so how do we make sure that they are weaving into the fabric of society in productive ways and have opportunities, those on-ramps, to participate? And right now, everyone's scared. Everyone's locked up in their houses. I live in Mount Pleasant in Washington, D.C., which is about 4 blocks from the National Zoo. And ICE, a couple of weeks ago, went right through the streets of Mount Pleasant in Washington, D.C., pulled out 11 people from their homes, from their apartment buildings. They went into the apartment buildings saying, we're looking for blah, blah, blah. Nobody had ever met this person, blah, blah, blah. But that was enough of an excuse. Are you in Washington, D.C.? Did you see this? Yeah. Yeah. And with the excuse that they're looking for whatever, they go into the apartment buildings and they're pulling moms, dads, kids, brothers, sisters from the apartments. This is not my America. It's not your America either. So that's why we have to work together. And this is why I liked Audrey's work, because it just can't be Latinx talking about Latinx. It can't be indigenous people. It can't be black. It can't be disabled. I mean, we can't go into our little silos. We have to come together, because together we're so powerful. But that takes different kind of work. It's way past the diversity, and it's way past the inclusion. It's the equity work. That's not, just being at the table is not enough. We need our voices shining through. Ooh, I have 0 minutes, but if I have one more question, I will. No? Okay, thank you.